She spoke 9 languages, and she was the first ruler of her family in nearly 300 years who bothered to learn the language of the people she ruled. She commanded fleets, survived civil wars, charmed the 2 most powerful men on earth, and held her drowning kingdom above the water by will alone for more than 2 decades. When she finally lost, she chose the hour and the manner of her own ending, and even her greatest enemy admitted that she had died like a queen. Rome called her a sorceress, a temptress, a danger dressed in silk. Egypt called her something older and stranger. To the priests along the Nile, she was the living image of the goddess Isis, mother of the world, the last pharaoh of a line of pharaohs stretching back 3,000 years into the morning of civilization. She was 21 different things to 21 different people, and almost none of them ever saw her clearly. Tonight we will try. We will walk the marble streets of Alexandria, when it was the greatest city on earth. We will stand in the lamplight of the palace where a teenage girl inherited a bankrupt kingdom and a murderous family. We will follow her down the Nile, across the sea to Rome, into the tent of Julius Caesar, and on to the golden barge that sailed to meet Mark Antony. And at the end, when the story grows quiet, we will stand in a locked room above the harbour as the last queen of Egypt closes her eyes. This is the entire story of Cleopatra, the final pharaoh, told slowly, gently, for the long hours of the night. Before we begin, let yourself settle. Lower the lights, let your shoulders sink, and if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. Now, let the story carry you. To understand Cleopatra, we have to begin long before her birth, in a summer month more than 2.5 centuries earlier, in the city of Babylon. There, in the year 323 BC, in a palace of glazed blue brick beside the Euphrates River, Alexander the Great lay dying. He was 32 years old. In 13 years he had conquered the largest empire the world had yet seen. From the mountains of Greece to the rivers of India, and now a fever was taking him apart, day by day, while his generals stood around his bed and waited. According to one story, when they asked him who should inherit his empire, he whispered only 2 words: to the strongest. Whether he truly said it hardly matters. It is what happened. The moment he stopped breathing, the strongest men in the room began to circle one another. And, within a generation, his empire had been torn into pieces like a loaf of bread divided among hungry soldiers. One of those soldiers was a stocky, careful, watchful Macedonian general named Ptolemy. He had grown up alongside Alexander, had fought in every major campaign, and he understood something his rivals did not. He did not want the whole empire. He wanted the best piece of it, while the others fought over Babylon and Macedonia and the wide, dangerous middle of Asia. Ptolemy quietly took Egypt. It was a masterstroke. Egypt was rich beyond anything in the Mediterranean world, fed by the annual flooding of the Nile, which laid down black, fertile soil year after year with the regularity of a heartbeat. It was protected by deserts to the east and west, by cataracts to the south, and by the sea to the north. It was, in effect, a fortress made of wheat. And Ptolemy did one thing more, a piece of theatre so audacious that people would talk about it for centuries. When Alexander's funeral procession set out from Babylon, an enormous golden carriage bearing the conqueror's embalmed body westward, Ptolemy met it on the road and simply took it. He hijacked the corpse of Alexander the Great. He carried the body to Egypt, and eventually laid it in a magnificent tomb in his new capital, where it would rest in a crystal coffin for centuries, a relic and an advertisement. Whoever held Alexander's body held a piece of his glory, and Ptolemy knew it. In 305 BC, he stopped pretending to govern on anyone's behalf, and crowned himself king. To the Greek world, he was Ptolemy I, called Soter the Saviour. To the Egyptians, after some careful negotiation with the ancient priesthoods, he was something more. He was Pharaoh. The priests anointed him as they had anointed kings since the age of the pyramids. And in the temple carvings, he appears in the old style, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, making offerings to gods who were already ancient when Greece was young. This was the bargain at the heart of the dynasty Cleopatra would inherit. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek at court, wrote Greek in their offices, drank Greek wine and argued Greek philosophy. But they wore the costume of pharaohs, built temples to Egyptian gods, and let two civilizations live side by side under one crown, never quite touching. For a while, it worked magnificently. The first three Ptolemies presided over a golden age. Money poured into the treasury from the wheat fields of the Nile Valley, from taxes on papyrus and linen and beer, from customs duties on every ship that passed through their harbours. And most of that money flowed into one place, the city that Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast in the winter of 331 BC, marking out its walls. So the story goes, with trails of barley flour, because no chalk could be found, he never saw a single building rise. He marched east and never returned, except as a body in a golden carriage. But the city took his name, and under the Ptolemies it became the wonder of the age, Alexandria. Remember that name, and hold the image of it gently as we go, because Alexandria is the true home of this story, the stage on which almost all of it will happen. It was a Greek city grafted onto Egyptian soil, facing the sea, looking toward Europe with the immense silent weight of Africa at its back. By the time Cleopatra was born, it may have held 500,000 people, perhaps more, making it the largest city in the Mediterranean world and possibly the largest on earth. It was a city of Greeks and Egyptians and Jews, of Syrians and Nubians and Arabs, of sailors and scholars and grain merchants, all packed together between a lake and the sea, arguing in a dozen languages under the bright coastal light, and it was ruled, for better and for worse, by a single family who, by Cleopatra's time, had been marrying one another, betraying one another, and murdering one another for 250 years. That family is where our queen begins, but before we meet her, let us walk through her city for a while. Slowly, the way a traveller might have walked it, because to fall asleep in Alexandria is to fall asleep in one of the most extraordinary places human beings have ever built. Imagine arriving by sea, because almost everyone did. Your ship has been sailing along a coastline so flat and featureless that the land itself hides below the horizon, and the first thing you see of Egypt is not land at all. It is a light. Far away across the water, a white tower rises where no tower should be, so tall that sailors claim to see it from more than 30 miles out. This is the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the world. It stands on a small island at the mouth of the harbour, joined to the city by a long causeway, and it climbs in 3 stages: a square base, an octagonal middle, a round tower at the top, to a height that ancient writers put at over 100 metres. By day, polished bronze mirrors at its summit catch the sun. By night, a fire burns there, fed endlessly with fuel hauled up through the core of the tower, and its glow slides across the dark water like a hand guiding ships home. Sailors coming from Greece, or Rome, or Syria watch that light grow for hours, and by the time the ship passes beneath the tower into the great harbour, the whole city has risen out of the sea to meet them. White limestone colonnades shining in the sun, palm trees and temple roofs, the masts of hundreds of ships packed so densely they look like a floating forest. The smell of salt and tar and spice and grain dust. This is the busiest port in the world. Grain ships the size of small towns load Egyptian wheat here to feed distant cities. Traders bring ivory and gold up from Africa, frankincense from Arabia, silk that has travelled hand to hand across all of Asia, pepper from India by way of the Red Sea ports. Everything flows through Alexandria, and the crown takes its share of all of it. Step ashore, and the city unfolds in a way almost no ancient city does. Alexandria is planned. Its streets cross at right angles in a great grid, and its main avenue, the Canopic Way, runs straight through the city from gate to gate, said to be wide enough for 8 chariots abreast, lined with colonnades that shade pedestrians from the sun. At night, unusually for the ancient world, parts of the city are lit, and life continues in the cool darkness. Music from courtyards, argument from wine shops, the creak of carts allowed in after dark. In the northeastern quarter, along the curve of the harbour, lies the palace district, the Brucheion, a city within the city. Here generations of Ptolemies have each added their own courts and gardens and colonnades, until nearly a third of Alexandria is royal ground, marble halls looking out over blue water, private harbours, groves of imported trees, and somewhere among them the tomb where Alexander himself lies in his crystal coffin, visited by kings and tourists alike. And here, within the palace quarter, stands the institution that makes Alexandria immortal. It is called the Museum, the House of the Muses, and it is not a museum in our sense, but something closer to a university, a research institute, a palace of the mind. The kings pay salaries to scholars from all over the Greek world to live here, eat together in a great communal hall, stroll its covered walks, and simply think. Attached to it is the library, the most famous library in human history, whose ambition is nothing less than to collect every book in the world. Ships entering the harbour are searched for scrolls, and any scrolls found are seized and copied. The copies, so the story goes, are returned to the owners. The originals stay in Alexandria. At its height, the library may hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated memory of the Mediterranean world, tragedy and mathematics, medicine and geography, star catalogues and cookbooks, and the collected arguments of 5 centuries of philosophy, all catalogued, all cross-referenced, all within one set of walls. The men who work here change the world quietly and permanently. Euclid organises geometry into a system that will be taught for over 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, a librarian, measures the circumference of the earth using shadows and arithmetic, and comes astonishingly close to the true figure. Herophilus studies the human body and concludes that the seat of intelligence is not the heart, as almost everyone believes, but the brain. Aristarchus proposes, 17 centuries before Copernicus, that the Earth travels around the Sun. Engineers here experiment with steam and gears and water clocks. Poets here edit Homer into the text we still read, all of it under royal patronage, because the Ptolemies understand something rare among kings. Knowledge is power of a kind, and glory of a kind, and Alexandria's brilliance makes its rulers shine. This is the city Cleopatra will grow up in. She is not a desert queen in a lonely palace. She is the daughter of the most sophisticated city on the planet, raised within walking distance of the greatest library ever assembled, taught by scholars who dine in the House of the Muses. When Romans later sneer at her as an exotic Eastern seductress, they are missing the truth by a comfortable mile. She is, among other things, one of the best educated human beings of her age, but a brilliant city is not the same thing as a healthy kingdom. and by the time Cleopatra is born, in the winter of 69 BC, the dynasty that built all this splendour has been rotting from the inside for 100 years. To see how far the family has fallen, and what kind of inheritance is waiting for her, we must look now at the strange, dark, tangled house of Ptolemy. Every royal family has its quarrels. The Ptolemies turned family quarrel into an art form, practiced it for generations, and sealed it inside the family by one fateful custom. They married each other, beginning with Ptolemy II, who married his own full sister Arsinoe. The dynasty adopted the old pharaonic tradition of brother-sister marriage. To Greeks, this was scandalous. To Egyptians, it echoed the gods themselves, Osiris and Isis, divine brother and divine wife. To the Ptolemies, it was policy. Royal blood married royal blood, and no ambitious foreign in-laws ever gained a foothold. But the custom had a shadow side that had nothing to do with health. It meant that every rival for the throne was a close relative, a brother, a sister, a mother, a son. The palace became a sealed arena. Ambition had nowhere to look but across the dinner table. And so the history of the later Ptolemies reads like a dark fable. Ptolemy IV was dominated by courtiers who murdered his mother, Ptolemy VIII, a corpulent and terrifying figure whom Alexandrians nicknamed Physcon, the potbelly, married his brother's widow, who was also his sister, then married her daughter, his niece, while remaining married to the mother. When the sister wife rebelled against him, he murdered the son they shared, and, according to the horrified ancient sources, sent the dismembered body to her as a birthday gift. Queens raised armies against their own sons. Mothers ruled through children and were strangled by them. Mobs of Alexandrians, who considered rioting something like a civic sport, dragged more than one Ptolemy from the palace. Between the murders, the same family kept building exquisite temples up and down the Nile, kept funding the library, kept wearing the double crown. Splendour and horror lived in the same house and used the same doors. And all the while, year by year, a shadow was growing in the west. Rome. When the dynasty began, Rome was a middling Italian republic that most Greeks barely thought about. By the time of Cleopatra's grandfather, Rome had crushed Carthage, swallowed Macedonia, humiliated Syria, and inherited whole kingdoms in its sleep. One king of Pergamon simply willed his country to Rome when he died, the way a man might leave a house to a nephew. Egypt remained independent, but it was the independence of a rich old estate surrounded on every side by an expanding empire, safe only because the Romans had not yet agreed among themselves on how to divide it. Roman senators spoke openly of Egypt as a prize waiting to be collected. Into this narrowing world came Cleopatra's father. His name was Ptolemy XII, and history remembers him by the nickname the Alexandrians gave him, Orletz, the flute player. It was not entirely a compliment. He was a devotee of the god Dionysus, fond of wine and music and theatrical religious festivals. And he liked to perform on the orlos, the double reed pipe, at palace gatherings. His enemies took this as proof of unseriousness. The truth was harder and sadder. Orletz was an illegitimate son who had been handed the throne after the Alexandrian mob lynched his predecessor, and he ruled a kingdom whose survival no longer depended on anything Egypt could do, only on what Rome decided. He understood this with painful clarity, and he made himself, in effect, the client of the Roman Republic. He flattered Roman generals. He entertained Roman visitors at ruinous expense, and in 59 BC he paid an almost unimaginable bribe, 6,000 talents, something close to an entire year of Egypt's revenue, to Julius Caesar, then consul, to have Rome formally recognize him as the lawful king of Egypt. He borrowed much of the money from a Roman financier named Rabirius, which meant that the crown of the pharaohs was now, in a very real sense, mortgaged to Roman bankers. The Alexandrians despised him for it. When Rome, shortly afterward, annexed Cyprus, which was ruled by his own brother, and that brother took poison rather than live as a Roman trophy, Aulet said nothing and did nothing because he could afford to do nothing. For the mob, that was the final insult. In 58 BC, the city rose against him, and the flute player fled Egypt, taking ship for Rome to beg, bribe, and borrow his way back onto his own throne. He left behind his children, and it is here, in a palace suddenly emptied of its king, that Cleopatra's own story truly begins, for she was one of those children, a girl of about 10 or 11, watching her family devour itself, watching Rome loom over everything, and learning, lesson by lesson, exactly what kind of world she would one day have to survive. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, most likely in Alexandria, in the winter season when the sea lanes closed and the great harbour grew quiet. Her full name was Cleopatra Thea Philipata, Cleopatra the goddess who loves her father, and she was the third child of Ptolemy Auletes. We do not know for certain who her mother was, which is a strange gap at the centre of such a famous life. She may have been the king's wife, Cleopatra V, who fades from the records around the time of her birth. Or she may have been a woman of a great Egyptian priestly family, which would help explain the daughter's unusual sympathy for Egyptian ways. The sources simply fall silent, and honesty asks us to leave the question open, like a door ajar in a dark hallway. What we do know is the household she grew up in. There were, in time, 6 royal children: Berenice IV, the eldest, Cleopatra VI, who vanishes early, our Cleopatra, the 7th of her name, a younger sister, Arsinoe, and 2 small brothers, both named Ptolemy, born when Cleopatra was already a girl of 8 and 11. Every one of these siblings, except the sister who died young, would eventually be destroyed by, or because of, one of the others. But in the beginning they were simply children's host, in the most beautiful palace in the world, raised by nurses and tutors among gardens and fountains, with the sound of the sea always somewhere below the windows. A Ptolemaic princess received a serious education, and Cleopatra received the most serious of all. Her tutors came from the circle of the museum, and she took to learning the way some children take to music. Rhetoric, the art of speaking, in which she would one day have few equals. Literature, Homer and Euripides and the poets of Alexandria. Mathematics, astronomy, and something of medicine, in which she kept a lifelong interest. Ancient writers later claimed she wrote or lent her name to treatises on remedies and cosmetics. But her most famous talent was language. The historian Plutarch, writing a century and a half later, marvelled at it. Her tongue, he said, was like an instrument of many strings, which she could turn to whatever language she pleased. She spoke to Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians, each in their own speech, and she was said to be the first Ptolemy in nearly 3 centuries to learn Egyptian, the language of the millions she would rule. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you who she was. For 250 years her ancestors had governed Egypt through interpreters, as if the country were a profitable estate whose tenants one need never actually meet. This girl learned the tenants' language. It was intelligence, but it was also strategy of a very deep kind, and perhaps it was something warmer than strategy. Her childhood, though, was not allowed to stay peaceful. When she was about 10 or 11, the mob drove her father from Egypt, and the palace she lived in changed rulers overnight. Her eldest sister, Berenice, was raised to the throne, first alongside a co-ruler, then alone, then beside a husband. The first husband chosen for Berenice was so repulsive to her a coarse Syrian pretender, whom the Alexandrians mockingly called the saltfish seller, that after a few days of marriage she had him strangled. The second, a more presentable prince named Archelaus, she kept. Meanwhile, far away in Rome, the exiled Auletes was spending 3 years doing what he did best, borrowing and bribing. He lodged in the villa of the wealthiest man in Rome, pledged sums he did not have to senators who did not trust him, and finally found his instrument. In 55 BC, a Roman governor in Syria, named Aulus Gabinius, encouraged by a payment of 10,000 talents, marched an army into Egypt. Leading the cavalry of that army was a broad-shouldered, curly-haired young Roman officer, 27 years old, charming, reckless, and already famous for being able to drink and fight with equal enthusiasm. His name was Mark Antony. Remember him? He rode into Alexandria as part of a foreign invasion, but he behaved, people noticed, with unusual grace. He treated the defeated with courtesy, admired the city, and when the fighting was over, he argued against savage reprisals. Somewhere in that captured palace was a 14-year-old princess named Cleopatra. Whether they truly met then, no one can say, though later writers love to imagine it. What is certain is what her father did next. Restored to his throne by Roman spears, Auletes had his own daughter Berenice executed. Cleopatra, at 14, was now the eldest surviving child of the king. She had watched her city fall to a Roman army, twice invited in by her own family. She had watched her father kill her sister. She had learned that thrones are borrowed things, that Rome is the true landlord of the world, and that the rent is paid in gold and blood. These were the lessons of her education that no tutor from the museum ever wrote down, and they were nearly complete. In the spring of 50 BC, worn out at last by exile, debt, wine, and worry, Ptolemy Auletes died in his bed, an achievement almost no Ptolemy of his century had managed. His will, a copy of which he had prudently lodged in Rome, named his heirs. The throne of Egypt would pass jointly to his eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra, now 18 years old, and her brother Ptolemy XIII, a boy of about 10. By family custom, they were expected to rule as king and queen together, sister and brother, goddess and god. The flute player was gone. The girl was queen, and everything she had learned was about to be tested at once. The Egypt that Cleopatra inherited in 51 BC was a magnificent house, with cracks running through every wall. The treasury was hollowed out by her father's debts. Roman financiers still held his enormous unpaid loans, and Roman politicians still eyed the Nile Valley the way a hungry man eyes a banquet through a window. Within the palace, real power was gripped by a committee of courtiers who ruled in the name of her child brother, and chief among them were 3 men whose names you may let drift past like shapes in the dark. Parthenos the eunuch, who controlled the money. Achaeas, who commanded the army. Theodotus of Chios, the boy king's tutor in rhetoric, clever and cold. To these men, the ideal monarch was 10 years old and obedient. An intelligent, ambitious, adult queen was a problem to be managed, then removed. Cleopatra understood her position perfectly, and in her first months she did something quietly radical. She began to rule as if she alone were sovereign. Early documents from her reign carry her name and image without her brothers, a silent declaration of intent. And she looked south, away from the palace and its schemers, toward the old Egypt of temples and priests that her ancestors had mostly ignored. Within her first year, an opportunity arrived that she seized with both hands. In the town of Hermonthis, near Thebes in Upper Egypt, the sacred bull known as Bukis had died. Egyptians worshipped this bull as the living soul of the war, god Montu, and the installation of a new sacred bull was a great religious occasion. Cleopatra did not merely approve the ceremony from her distant palace, as her forefathers would have done. She travelled hundreds of miles up the Nile and attended it in person, and an inscription set up by the priests records, with unmistakable wonder, that the queen herself rode the sacred bull across the river in the barge of Amun in the sight of everyone. Picture the scene as it settles into the drowsy part of your mind. The brown river wide and slow under the enormous southern sky. Crowds of Egyptians packed along both banks, farmers and priests and children, most of whom had never seen a Ptolemy in their lives. Incense smoke rising straight up in the still air, and in the middle of the water, a gilded barge carrying a garlanded bull and a 19-year-old Greek queen who had learned their language and come to honour their god. The priests of Egypt never forgot it. Through every disaster that followed, the temples remained loyal to her. And that loyalty was not an accident. It was the first masterpiece of her statecraft. But statecraft could not fill the granaries. In those same first years, the Nile flood failed, not once, but twice. The river on which everything depended rose weakly. The black fields shrank, and hunger crept up the valley like a slow tide. In 50 BC, a royal decree, which still survives, ordered that all grain moving through Middle Egypt be shipped to Alexandria and nowhere else on pain of death. The capital, with its restless and riot-prone crowds, had to be fed first. The countryside tightened its belt. Behind the decree, we can feel the pressure closing around the young queen. An empty treasury, a hungry population, a hostile court, and then her enemies moved. By 49 BC, the faction of Pothinus had succeeded in pushing Cleopatra aside. Her name disappears from the documents, and the regime of Ptolemy XIII, aged 12, stands alone. The precise sequence is lost, but the outcome is plain. Sometime in that year, the Queen of Egypt slipped out of Alexandria, eastward past the marshes of the Delta, and vanished into exile. Most rulers, so displaced, would have run to Rome to beg, as her father had. Cleopatra did something different. She went to the deserts and cities of the east, to Syria and the lands along the edge of Egypt, and there, out of loyal officials, hired spears, and her own force of persuasion, this 21-year-old woman raised an army. By 48 BC, she was marching back toward Egypt at its head. Her brother's generals brought the royal army east to meet her, and the two forces settled into position on either side of the fortress of Pelusium, the eastern gate of Egypt, where the desert meets the sea. Brother against sister, each claiming the double crown, the whole ancient kingdom holding its breath. It was exactly the kind of grim family arithmetic the Ptolemies had practiced for generations, and it seemed likely to resolve the usual way, in one quick treacherous battle, but it never came to that battle. Because at that precise moment, in the late summer of 48 BC, the outside world arrived on Egypt's shore, in the person of a single desperate Roman, and nothing in Cleopatra's life, or in the history of Egypt, would ever be the same again. The Roman was Pompey the Great. For decades he had been the most celebrated soldier in the world, conqueror of the East, 3 times consul, the man whose very nickname, Magnus, meant great. But Rome had fallen into civil war between Pompey and his rival, Julius Caesar, and in August of 48 BC Caesar had shattered Pompey's army at Pharsalus in Greece. Now the great man was a fugitive, sailing the eastern Mediterranean with his wife, a handful of ships, and the remains of his dignity, searching for a friendly harbour. He chose Egypt. He had been the patron of Cleopatra's father. The reigning boy king owed his throne, in part, to Pompey's support in Rome. Surely here, of all places, he would find refuge, his small fleet anchored off Pelusium, where the rival royal armies were encamped, and he sent word ashore, asking to be received. In the king's tent, the courtiers debated what to do with him. Theodotus, the rhetoric tutor, is said to have summed up the options with lethal neatness. Receive Pompey, and they would inherit his war and Caesar's enmity. Turn him away, and Pompey would remember it if he ever recovered. Kill him, and they would earn Caesar's gratitude and fear no one. For dead men, said the teacher of rhetoric, do not bite. The council agreed. On the 28th of September, a small boat rowed out to Pompey's ship, carrying Achilles, the general, and a Roman officer named Septimius, who had once served under Pompey himself. They invited him ashore, explaining that the shallow water would not admit his ship. Pompey's wife, Cornelia, begged him not to go. He went, because a man like Pompey could not be seen to be afraid of a rowboat. As the boat neared the beach, in full view of his wife watching from the deck, Septimius ran him through from behind. They cut off his head and left his body in the surf. He was 58 years old, and one day short of the anniversary of his greatest triumphs. His freedmen built him a pyre on the sand, out of the wreckage of an old fishing boat. So ended the great Pompey on the edge of Egypt, murdered by the advisors of a 13-year-old king in order to please a Roman they had never met. 4 days later, the Romans sailed into the harbour of Alexandria with a small fleet and about 4,000 men. Julius Caesar was 52 years old, lean, balding, famously energetic, the most dangerous man alive. When Theodotus came aboard, glowing with expectation, and presented him with Pompey's severed head and signet ring, Caesar did not reward him. He turned away and, the sources say, wept. Pompey had been his rival, but also once his ally and his son-in-law, and Romans of Caesar's stamp did not care to have their equals butchered by foreign courtiers. It was a poor beginning, and matters quickly grew worse. Caesar came ashore with his consular insignia carried before him, as if entering a Roman town, and the Alexandrian crowd, ferociously proud of their independence, rioted for days. Caesar, with too few soldiers to overawe the city, installed himself in the royal palace and did the most Roman thing imaginable. He announced that as executor of the old king's will, he would arbitrate the dispute between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra, and he summoned both to appear before him. He also mentioned, in passing, that Egypt still owed him a very large amount of money. The boy king's faction returned to Alexandria and set about charming and obstructing him. But for Cleopatra, the summons was a trap with no visible way in. Her brother's army held Pelusium and every road to the capital. Her brother's officers watched the harbour. If she came openly, she would be arrested or killed long before she reached Caesar's door. What happened next is the most famous story ever told about her, and it comes to us from Plutarch. She came by sea at dusk in a small boat with a single Sicilian friend named Apollodorus, and slipped into the palace harbour under the noses of her enemies. Then, since she could hardly walk through the halls unrecognised, she had Apollodorus wrap her in a large sack of the kind used for bedding and carpets, tie it with a cord, hoist it over his shoulder, and carry it through the corridors of her own palace, past the guards, into the presence of Julius Caesar, where the sack was set down, untied and opened, and out of it, smoothing her dress, rose the 21-year-old Queen of Egypt. Later ages would paint her tumbling from a rolled carpet, glittering and bare-shouldered. The truth was probably dustier and far more nerve-wracking, and that only improves it. Everything she was appeared in that single gesture: the daring, the theatrical instinct, the refusal to accept the locked door. Caesar, a lifelong connoisseur of audacity, was reportedly captivated before she said a word. And then she said words, and it was over. By morning, Caesar had decided that the will of Altes clearly required brother and sister to rule jointly, which meant in practice, that Cleopatra was restored. When young Ptolemy arrived and found his sister installed at Caesar's side, serene and unassailable, he understood instantly what had happened. He tore the royal diadem from his head, ran out to the crowds, and screamed that he had been betrayed. He was not entirely wrong. But the game was no longer his to call, and the city outside the palace walls was already reaching for its weapons. What followed is remembered as the Alexandrian War, and it very nearly ended the story of both Caesar and Cleopatra in its first weeks. Pothinus, the eunuch, still controlling the boy king and the treasury, secretly summoned the royal army from Pelusium. 20,000 hardened soldiers under Achilles marched on Alexandria, and Caesar, with barely 4,000 men, suddenly found himself besieged in the palace quarter of the largest city in the world, holding a queen, a sulking boy king, and a strip of shoreline. The fighting that flared through that autumn and winter was unlike anything his legions had known. Not open battle, but a savage struggle of streets and rooftops and barricades, fought house by house against soldiers and citizens alike. For the Alexandrian crowd had joined the war with enthusiasm. Missiles rained from roofs, barricades of stone blocks, 3 men high sealed the great avenues. The fighting rolled down to the water, where the royal fleet threatened to trap Caesar's ships and cut him off from the sea, his only source of reinforcement and food. Caesar responded with characteristic ruthlessness. He burned the ships in the harbour. The fire leapt from the docks into the warehouses along the shore, and in the confusion it consumed buildings that, according to several ancient writers, contained tens of thousands of scrolls. Some said 40,000 books burned, others said far more, and later legend would blame Caesar for destroying the great library itself. The truth was probably smaller, warehoused scrolls awaiting export rather than the library proper, which appears in the sources alive and working for generations afterward. But something of Alexandria's written soul went up in that fire, and the smoke of burning papyrus drifted over a city, tearing itself apart. The war turned personal and strange, as Ptolemaic wars always did. Inside the besieged palace, Pothinus was caught smuggling messages to the enemy, and Caesar had him executed. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, a teenager, with the full measure of the family's ambition, escaped the palace, fled to the besieging army, and had herself proclaimed queen in opposition to her sister, then arranged the murder of the general Achilles in a quarrel over command. The city was now being fought over by, in effect, 3 siblings and a Roman. At one point, the defenders pumped seawater into the conduits supplying Caesar's quarter, fouling the wells, and his men dug frantically for fresh water along the beach. At another, during an amphibious scramble for the causeway by the lighthouse, Caesar's position collapsed, and he had to leap from a crowded, sinking boat and swim for his life through the harbour, holding, one story insists, important papers above his head, with one hand, while soldiers drowned around him under the weight of their armour. The most powerful man in the world, floundering in the water of the great harbour within sight of the Pharos. It was that close, in the middle of the siege, hoping to calm the city. Caesar released young Ptolemy XIII, who tearfully swore friendship, and then, the moment he reached his army, threw himself into the war against Caesar with everything he had. No one was surprised. At last, in the early spring of 47 BC, a relief army raised in Syria, and Judea came marching down into the delta, led by an ally named Mithridates of Pergamon. Caesar slipped out of the city, joined forces with him, and brought the young king's army to battle in the countryside near the Nile. The Egyptian army was broken and driven into the river marshes. The king's camp was stormed, and somewhere in the chaos of the retreat, a boat overloaded with fugitives capsized in the Nile, and Ptolemy XIII, aged 15, wearing golden armour, went down into the brown water and did not come up. When the fighting ended, Caesar rode back into Alexandria through streets suddenly full of citizens dressed as suppliants, and the war simply stopped. He had won, and now he did something that every Roman senator would have found unthinkable. He did not annex Egypt. The richest prize in the Mediterranean lay conquered at his feet, and he handed it back. He placed Cleopatra on the throne, married her, for the sake of custom, to her surviving brother, Ptolemy XIV, a boy of about 12, who would reign in name only, and he sent the dangerous Arsinoe to Italy as a prisoner. Egypt would remain independent, ruled by a queen who owed him everything and, by now, was carrying his child, for there was no longer any secret about the two of them. The 52-year-old Roman and the 21-year-old queen had become lovers, sometime in those besieged winter months, in a palace lit by war fires, and what began as politics had grown into something with warmth in it. That spring, with the war won and the season soft, the two of them did something almost scandalous in its leisure. They went on a cruise, a great royal barge, one of the famous floating palaces of the Ptolemies, with banqueting rooms and shaded colonnades and gardens on its decks, carried them up the Nile, escorted, one source claims, by 400 ships. They drifted south past Memphis and the pyramids, already more ancient to them than they are distant from us, past the temples of Upper Egypt, where the priests came down to the water to hail the queen as Isis and her companion as a god. For Cleopatra it was policy of the most brilliant kind, displaying to the whole river valley that she ruled and that the power of Rome stood behind her. But, drifting slowly upstream in the warm evenings, watching herons lift off the water and the hills turn violet, it does not seem to have felt like policy. It seems from this distance like the one unhurried season in two crowded lives. And what a country there was to drift through. From the deck of the barge, Egypt revealed itself the way it had revealed itself to travellers for thousands of years, as two thin ribbons of impossible green running through an ocean of tawny desert, with the river laid down the middle like poured bronze. Villages of mud brick slid past on the banks, each with its palms and its dovecotes and its water wheels, creaking in the heat. Farmers straightened from the fields to watch the golden ship pass, shading their eyes, calling to their children. Fishermen in papyrus skiffs drew in their nets to let the flotilla through. At Memphis, the ancient capital, the high priest of Ptah came out with his shaven-headed clergy to perform the old rites, and beyond the city the pyramids stood on their plateau in the shimmering air, already 26 centuries old, their casing stones still smooth enough in places to throw back the sun. Caesar, who had chased his enemies across 3 continents, is said to have questioned the priests about the sources of the Nile, and to have mused that he would abandon everything to discover them. In the evenings, the barge tied up in quiet reaches of the river, and the sounds of Egypt came aboard with the cooling air, frogs along the margins, the sift of wind in the reeds, somewhere a herdsman singing to his cattle in the oldest language in the world. Cleopatra had travelled this river before as a girl in exile and as a queen honouring a sacred bull. Now she travelled it as its undisputed mistress, showing her country to the most powerful man alive, and showing him, mile by unhurried mile, exactly what he had chosen to protect. Then Rome called. Caesar had wars waiting on 3 continents, and in the summer of 47 BC he sailed away, leaving 3 legions to guard the queen and the kingdom. Weeks later, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, and the Alexandrians, with their genius for nicknames, called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. His father by then was on the other side of the sea. But he had not forgotten, and neither had she. For the next 3 years, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with a firm hand and one eye on Rome. The country she governed had been battered by famine, by civil war, by armies trampling the delta, and the surviving papyri from these years show a ruler drowning in detail and mastering it. Decrees on grain shipments, on tax relief for temple lands, on the misbehaviour of royal officials. Alexandria was quiet. The priests were loyal. The child, Caesarion, grew in the palace by the sea, a living link between the house of Ptolemy and the master of the world. And in 46 BC, that master summoned her. Caesar had crushed his remaining enemies and returned to Rome to celebrate 4 triumphs on a scale no one had ever seen. Days of processions, spoils, banquets for the whole city. And among the spectacles was one that concerned Egypt closely. In the Egyptian triumph, walking in chains before the chariot, came the princess Arsinoe, Cleopatra's own sister, displayed as a captive to the roaring crowds. Romans were accustomed to seeing defeated chieftains strangled at the climax of a triumph. But the sight of a young woman in chains moved the crowd to unexpected pity, and Caesar, reading the mood, spared her. She was sent to live in sanctuary at the great temple of Artemis in Ephesus, across the sea in Asia, out of the game, but not out of the story. Cleopatra herself came to Rome that year in state, as an allied monarch, bringing her boy husband Ptolemy XIV, and, almost certainly, her infant son. Caesar lodged her in his own garden villa, across the Tiber, a compound of terraces and colonnades above the river, and there she held court for the better part of 2 years. Roman society came to look fascinated and hostile in equal measure. Senators' wives studied her jewels, philosophers and astronomers sought audiences. For the queen had brought scholars in her train, and it was whispered that Caesar's new project of reforming the chaotic Roman calendar into a rational year of 365 days leaned on the astronomy of Alexandria. The orator Cicero called on her at the villa and came away seething. "I hate the queen," he wrote flatly to a friend, still fuming months later about her arrogance, though he was vague about what exactly she had done to him, except, perhaps, fail to be impressed. Part of the friction, it must be said, was the cities themselves. Rome in 46 BC was the capital of the world, and looked nothing like it. It was a vast, magnificent, chaotic town of narrow, crooked streets and creaking tenements, mud in winter and dust in summer, its public spaces splendid, and its private quarters squeezed, a city that had grown like a thicket, rather than being planned like a garden. To a queen raised amid the swept marble grids of Alexandria, with its wide avenues and its lighthouse and its library, Rome can only have felt provincial, and Romans, who suspected as much, resented her for noticing. Yet her villa on the far bank of the Tiber became, for 2 seasons, one of the most interesting addresses in Italy. The queen kept a proper Alexandrian salon. Astronomers from the museum could be met there, and physicians and philosophers, and men of letters drifted across the river to dine and argue, and examine the fabled visitor at close range. She talked easily with all of them, in whichever language served, and those who came to sneer often stayed late. Caesar himself was busy remaking the state, and among his projects, that winter was one with Alexandria's fingerprints on it everywhere. The old Roman calendar, kept by priests who added months for political convenience, had drifted so badly that harvest festivals fell in spring. Caesar convened experts, chief among them the astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, and together they built a new year of 365 days. With an extra day every 4th year, the solar arithmetic of Egypt dressed in Roman names. It took effect on the 1st of January 45 BC, and with one later refinement, it is the same calendar the world keeps today. Whatever Rome thought of the Queen across the river, it would spend the rest of history telling time by her city's science. Rome did not know what to do with her. She was everything the Republic officially despised: an absolute monarch, an Eastern sovereign, a woman with power, and she was living in Caesar's garden, with a son whose face, people muttered, looked distinctly familiar. Caesar did nothing to calm the muttering. He placed a gilded statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestress of his own family, where it stood among the objects of worship. The insult to custom was breathtaking: a foreign queen set up in gold inside a Roman temple, and it fed a growing unease. Caesar was accumulating honours beyond all precedent: dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life, his image on the coinage, a throne of gold in the Senate house. Was the Queen whispering monarchy into his ear? Would he move the capital to Alexandria? Rumour bred rumour in the winter air. Whatever Caesar truly intended, and he kept his own counsel to the end, 60 men decided not to wait and find out. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Julius Caesar walked into a Senate meeting in the portico attached to Pompey's theatre, and was surrounded by senators pressing petitions. The first blow came from behind. 23 followed. He fell, bleeding from every side, at the base of a statue of Pompey, the rival whose severed head had once been presented to him on an Egyptian beach. Across the river in the garden villa, Cleopatra received the news that the father of her son, the shield over her kingdom, the centre of her whole political world, was lying dead in a portico with his toga pulled over his face. And then, within days, a second blow. Caesar's will was opened and read. It named as his heir not Caesarion, who, as a foreigner, could inherit nothing in Roman law, but his 18-year-old grandnephew, a slight, cold-eyed, chronically unwell young man named Gaius Octavius, thereafter called Octavian. For Cleopatra, the will was a door closing softly. Rome now belonged to Caesar's avengers and Caesar's assassins, who would shortly begin killing one another. And no one in that city had any reason to protect an Egyptian queen and her inconveniently named son. Within a month she'd packed her household, her scholars, her guards, and her small son, whose existence was now a danger rather than an asset, and slipped down the Tiber to the sea. There were no farewells worth recording. The gilded statue stayed behind, in the temple of Venus, curiously untouched through all the years that followed, gleaming in the incense smoke, while Rome tore itself apart, and it was still standing there. Travellers reported, 2 centuries later, its original sailed for Alexandria through the spring storms and never saw Italy again. And back in Alexandria, with the world sliding into a new civil war, she moved to secure the only inheritance she could still control. Her brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy, now about 15, died that summer. Suddenly and conveniently, and ancient writers state plainly what everyone assumed, that the queen had him poisoned. In his place, she raised her 3-year-old son to the throne. Egypt would be ruled by Cleopatra and Caesarion, the goddess and the son of a god. And there was no longer anyone standing between her and the crown. There was only the storm gathering across the sea. The storm took 3 years to arrive, and Cleopatra spent them walking a rope over an abyss. Rome's civil war split the world in 2. On one side stood the assassins of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, who seized the eastern provinces and squeezed them for men and money. On the other stood Caesar's avengers, his deputy Mark Antony, and his heir Octavian, uneasily allied. Both sides demanded Egyptian support, and both were close enough to hurt her. Cassius, gathering his forces in Syria, demanded her fleet, and dark stories later circulated that he had considered invading Egypt outright. Cleopatra stalled, pleaded famine and plague, which were real enough, for the Nile had failed again, and sickness stalked the delta, and quietly sent aid to the Caesarean side. When she finally led her own war fleet out in person to join Antony and Octavian, a storm wrecked the expedition and nearly drowned her, and she limped home, ill, having risked her life without reaching the war. In the autumn of 42 BC, at Philippi in northern Greece, Antony crushed Brutus and Cassius, both of whom died on their own swords. The east now belonged to Mark Antony, and every ruler in it lined up to grovel. He set up court in Asia Minor, dazzling and terrifying the local kings, styling himself the new Dionysus, god of wine and liberation, while cities burned incense in the streets to greet him, and to Cleopatra he sent a summons. The Queen of Egypt was to come to him at Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, and answer accusations that she had aided his enemies. She had been summoned by Romans before. She remembered how it was done, and the arrival she staged at Tarsus in 41 BC became, thanks to Plutarch's loving description, one of the most famous entrances in all of history. She came sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with a gilded stern, purple sails spread, silver oars rising and falling to the music of flutes and pipes. She herself lay beneath a canopy spangled with gold, dressed as Venus in a painting, while boys costumed as Cupids fanned her, and her most beautiful maids, dressed as sea nymphs and graces, worked the ropes and the rudder. Clouds of perfume drifted from the vessel to the crowded riverbanks. Word ran through Tarsus that Venus had come to feast with Dionysus for the happiness of Asia, and the entire population poured out of the city to line the water, until Antony, waiting to receive her, enthroned in the marketplace like a proper Roman magistrate, found himself sitting completely alone. The summons had been reversed before a word was spoken. When Antony invited her to dinner, she declined and invited him instead. He came aboard to a banquet of staggering luxury under a ceiling of lights arranged in patterns, and at the end of it, in a gesture Alexandria had perfected, the golden dishes and couches were presented to the guests as gifts. Antony, a soldier's soldier who prided himself on rough charm, tried to match her hospitality the following night, fell hopelessly short, and had the good humour to laugh at himself. The banquets went on for 4 nights, each outdoing the last, and on the 4th, so the accounts run, the floor of the dining hall was carpeted, knee-deep in roses held down under nets, so that the guests waded through perfume to reach their couches. It was excess with a purpose, as everything the Queen staged had a purpose. Every lamp and petal said the same thing, in a language any Roman commander understood. Egypt is rich beyond your imagining, and Egypt is offering you its friendship. That may have been the moment it truly began, for of all her weapons, Plutarch says, her conversation was the most irresistible, and she quickly took the measure of this big, generous, swaggering, insecure man. He was 13 years her senior, the greatest soldier alive now that Caesar was gone, master of the richest half of the Roman world, and lonely in the particular way of men who are never alone. Whatever the accusations at Tarsus had been, they dissolved. Her sister Arsine, still sheltering at Ephesus, and still a rallying point for plots, was dragged from sanctuary on Antony's orders and killed on the temple steps, the last of Cleopatra's rivals extinguished at her request. And when the Queen sailed home to Alexandria as the year turned cold, the new Dionysus left his armies, his provinces, and his neglected duties, and followed her. The winter that Antony spent in Alexandria from late 41 into the spring of 40 BC, passed into legend almost while it was happening. He came not as a Roman magistrate, but as a private guest, wearing Greek dress instead of his uniform, and the queen made her city into a theatre of pleasure for him. They hunted in the marshes, diced, drank, and toured the streets. At night, the stories say, the two of them would put on servants' clothes and wander the lanes of Alexandria in disguise, knocking on doors and teasing the people inside, and though half the city knew perfectly well who the tall Roman and his laughing companion were, the Alexandrians, who outloved wit above almost everything, adored them for it. At the centre of that winter was a private society the lovers founded with their circle of friends. They called it the Inimitable Livers, the company of those whose life could not be imitated, and its members took turns hosting banquets of competitive extravagance. A physician named Philotas, then a medical student in Alexandria, left an eyewitness account that Plutarch preserved, wandering into the royal kitchens. One evening, Philotas saw 8 wild boars roasting whole at different stages, and asked in amazement how many guests were expected. The cook laughed. Only about 12, he said. But since no one could say when Antony would want dinner, whether now, or in an hour, or after another round of wine, a separate feast was begun at intervals, so that whenever the summons finally came, one of the boars would be at perfection. Supper, the cook said, was not one supper, but many. That kitchen, with its rotating fires and patient cooks, is as good a portrait of the winter as any. Yet it would be a mistake, and Cleopatra's enemies made it deliberately, to see only the wine. The queen, who diced with Antony at midnight, spent her mornings with grain reports and harbour counts. The city around the palace hummed with ordinary life. All that winter, dockworkers unloading timber and silver, schoolboys reciting Homer, linen weavers and glass-blowers and papyrus makers at their benches, priests chanting the hours in the temple of Serapis on its hill. Egypt was governed, and governed well, while its queen entertained the master of the East. And the entertainment itself was an instrument, binding Antony to Alexandria with silk threads no treaty could match. Then the world intruded, as it always did. In the spring of 40 BC, 2 pieces of news reached Alexandria almost together. In Italy, Antony's fierce wife, Fulvia, and his brother had raised a war against Octavian in Antony's name, without asking him, and had been crushed. And in the east, while the new Dionysus feasted, the Parthian Empire had surged across the frontier, overrunning Syria and pouring into Asia Minor. Antony's world was on fire at both ends. He sailed at once, and events moved with brutal speed. Fulvia, fleeing Italy, met him in Greece, was blamed, fell ill, and died. And her death, whatever grief it carried, opened a political door. That autumn at Brundisium, Antony and Octavian, their armies refusing to fight one another, patched their alliance and sealed it in the traditional Roman way, with a wedding. Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a woman celebrated even by her enemies for beauty, intelligence, and goodness. Rome sighed with relief. Coins showed the happy couple. Poets wrote of a new golden age. In Alexandria, Cleopatra received the news in silence, and a few weeks later, without ceremony, in the palace by the sea, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, Antony's children. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. Their father, married to another woman in another world, would not set eyes on them for 3.5 years. For those 3.5 years, Cleopatra ruled alone and waited, and history looked, for a while, as if it had chosen a different road. Antony lived in Athens with Octavia, who bore him 2 daughters and managed his affairs with tact even his friends found remarkable. His general Ventidius drove the Parthians back out of Syria in brilliant campaigns. The arrangement with Octavian creaked but held. A sensible man would have stayed on that road, but Antony was planning the project of his life. A full-scale invasion of Parthia, the great unfinished ambition of Caesar himself. And for that he needed what Octavian would never give him: limitless money, grain, timber, and a secure base in the east. There was exactly one place to find all four. In the autumn of 37 BC, he sent for Cleopatra to come to him at Antioch in Syria, and the meeting there rearranged the map of the world. What they concluded was a pact of extraordinary scope. Cleopatra received back, at the stroke of Antony's pen, great pieces of the old Ptolemaic Empire that Rome had absorbed over the past century. Cyprus, the cedar coast of Phoenicia, rich stretches of Syria and Cilicia, the balsam groves of Jericho, whose perfume trade was worth a fortune. It was the dream of every Ptolemy for 6 generations, and she had achieved it without an army leaving Egypt. She marked the moment, as dynasties mark such moments, by starting time over. Her documents and coins began to carry a double date. The 16th year of her reign counted also as the first. Year 16, which is also year 1. The calendar itself announcing that a new age had opened, the age of the restored empire of the Ptolemies. In return, Egypt's wealth stood behind Antony's Parthian war, and there was more than treaty in it. From Antioch onward, the two of them lived openly as a couple, and by some accounts underwent a form of marriage, meaningless in Roman law, since a Roman could not legally marry a foreigner. And Antony remained married to Octavia, but full of meaning in the east. He acknowledged the twins, and coins began to appear with his head on one side, and Cleopatra's on the other, a Roman commander and an Egyptian queen stamped together into the money of the east. Those coins are worth pausing over, because they are among the only faces of Cleopatra we can still hold in a hand. They do not show the languid beauty of the films. They show a strong profile, a prominent nose, a firm mouth and chin, the face of a ruler stamped in the same dyes as a Roman general, deliberately powerful rather than deliberately pretty. And this fits what the most careful ancient writer actually says. Her beauty, Plutarch insists, was not in itself incomparable, not the kind that stuns at first sight. It was her presence that was irresistible, the charm of her conversation, the persuasion of her voice, the quickness that played through everything she said, so that the impression she left, he wrote, had a sting in it. Men did not fall because she was lovely, they fell because she was interesting, which is a rarer and far more dangerous thing. In Rome, each of those coins landed like a small insult. Octavian collected them all in the spring of 36 BC. Antony marched for Parthia with over 100,000 men, one of the largest armies Rome had ever assembled, and Cleopatra, pregnant again, travelled with him as far as the Euphrates before turning home. What followed was catastrophe. Trying to move fast, Antony left his siege train behind, and the Parthians destroyed it along with 2 legions. His great siege of the city of Pharaspa stalled as summer died. His Armenian allies deserted. And when he finally ordered retreat, the army had to fight its way through mountain country in worsening cold, harassed day and night by Parthian horse archers, 18 pitched engagements in 27 days, hunger, poisoned plants, snow. He lost perhaps a third of his entire force, most of it without a battle. The survivors of that retreat carried stories out of the mountains that Romans told for a generation, of soldiers so hungry they dug roots that clouded the mind, of the whole army at the worst hour, locking shields over their heads like a roof of bronze while arrows rattled on it like hail, of Antony himself, who was never better than in disaster, walking the lines at night weeping openly for his men, calling veterans by name, begging them to eat and to march one more day. They loved him for it, which is its own kind of epitaph. The survivors staggered to the Syrian coast in midwinter, and Antony, drinking hard and scanning the sea, sent to Egypt for help. He waited for her at a small harbour town, and those with him recorded how he could not sit still through a meal, rising again and again in the middle of the wine to walk down and stare at the empty water until the sails of Egypt finally showed on the horizon. Cleopatra came with ships, money, and clothing for the freezing troops, and she came pointedly. Before Octavia could arrive from Italy, with the modest aid Octavian allowed his sister to bring, Antony took the queen's help and sent his Roman wife home without seeing her. Octavia, with a loyalty that broke Roman hearts and served her brother's propaganda perfectly, continued to care for Antony's children and his interests in Rome. The lines were now drawn in everything but name, and in 34 BC, after a face-saving campaign in which he conquered Armenia, Antony returned to Alexandria and staged the ceremony that made war certain. He celebrated a triumph, the most sacred victory ritual of Rome, not in Rome but in Alexandria, riding through the city in a chariot, with the captive Armenian king walking in silver chains before him, while Cleopatra presided from a golden throne. Days later came a grander scene still, remembered as the Donations of Alexandria. In the great gymnasium of Alexandria, where the city's young men trained and its great assemblies gathered, or under awnings against the late autumn sun, on a stage of silver, on 2 golden thrones, sat Antony and Cleopatra. She robed as the goddess Isis, and below them on smaller thrones their children. Before the assembled city, Antony rose and distributed the east. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, and Caesarion, now 13, King of Kings, joint ruler of Egypt, and, Antony declared, the true and legitimate son of Julius Caesar. The little ones received kingdoms like birthday gifts. Alexander Helios, dressed in Persian costume, was named Lord of Armenia and all lands beyond the Euphrates. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, received Cyrenaica and Libya, and the newest child, 3-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus, toddling in a miniature Macedonian cloak and boots, was given Syria and Asia Minor. Much of this was theatre, titles draped over territories. Rome had not even conquered, but as a statement of intent it was unmistakable. Antony was recasting the Roman East as a family of client kingdoms under a Greek-speaking dynasty, with Alexandria at its heart and the son of Caesar at its head. When his written account of the ceremony reached Rome and he asked the Senate to ratify it, even his own supporters quietly buried the dispatch. Octavian did not bury anything. He had been handed the weapon he needed, a rival who could be painted as no longer Roman at all, and he began, with cold method and limitless patience, to sharpen it, speech by speech, rumour by rumour, coin by coin, through 2 long years in which not a single soldier marched, and the war was already being won. The war that decided the fate of the world began not with soldiers but with words, and the words were merciless. For 3 years, Rome was soaked in the most sophisticated propaganda campaign antiquity ever produced, and its target, by careful design, was not Antony but Cleopatra. Octavian understood that Romans dreaded another civil war against fellow citizens, so he gave them a foreign enemy instead. The Queen of Egypt became, in speeches and pamphlets and verses, a monstrous seductress who had bewitched a great Roman with drugs and luxury, a barbarian despot served by eunuchs who worshipped animal-headed gods and dreamed of enthroning herself on the capital. Her very existence was framed as an attack on Roman manhood, and Antony, as her besotted slave, lost to wine and Eastern robes, no longer truly Roman at all. Antony answered from Alexandria with pamphlets of his own, mocking Octavian's cowardice in battle, his ancestry, his hypocrisies, and in one surviving letter he demanded, in barrack room language, why his old ally was so exercised about the queen. "She is my wife," he wrote, "and what does it matter where a man finds his pleasure?" It was a soldier's shrug, and it played straight into his enemy's hands. In the spring of 32 BC, Antony made the break formal at last, and sent Octavia notice of divorce, and she left his house in Rome, carrying his children, weeping, the neighbours said, not for herself, but for the war her leaving made certain. At almost the same moment, too, of Antony's most senior followers, the polished and flexible Plancus and his nephew, Titius, read the direction of the wind and defected to Octavian, and they carried with them a piece of information beyond price. They had witnessed Antony's will, and they knew what was in it, and they knew where it was kept. Then Octavian crossed a line even Romans found shocking, learning that Antony's will had been deposited, as custom required. With the Vestal Virgins, he seized it by force and read it aloud to the Senate. Genuine or doctored, its contents were incendiary. Antony affirmed Caesarion as Caesar's true son. He left legacies to his children by Cleopatra, and he directed that, wherever he died, his body should be carried to Alexandria and buried beside the queen. That last clause did the work of 10 legions. A Roman commander who wished to lie for eternity in Egyptian soil had, in the eyes of Rome, already deserted. Octavia was ordered out of Antony's house in Rome, and she went, weeping, taking his children with her, still refusing to speak ill of him. Rome that year was a city feeding on omens and whispers. It was said that the queen's favourite oath was, "As surely as I shall, one day give judgment on the capital." It was said that sweat had beaded on statues, that a temple of the war god had opened its doors of its own accord, that strange lights had marched across the sky, the standard furniture of Roman dread, all of it pointing east. Octavian gave the dread a channel across Italy and the western provinces. Communities were led through a personal oath of loyalty, not to the state but to Octavian himself, swearing to follow him against his enemies, and he would later boast that all Italy had sworn to him of its own free will. It was the first plebiscite of the coming empire, dressed as a war rally against a foreign queen. Not all of Rome swore. At the start of that year, both serving consuls and something like 300 senators, nearly a third of the whole Senate, slipped out of Italy and made their way east to Antony's side. A silent parade of togas boarding ships. And for a while there were, in effect, 2 Roman governments, one in Rome and one in a war camp in Greece, each calling the other the traitor. History remembers the winners' names and has largely misplaced the 300, which is what history does. In 32 BC, the Senate stripped Antony of his powers, and Octavian, in an archaic ceremony revived for the occasion, hurled a spear toward the east and declared war, not on Antony, never on Antony, but on Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. The fiction was preserved to the end. Rome was not fighting Romans. Rome was defending itself against a woman. It is one of history's small, bleak jokes that the fiction was also a compliment, the largest ever paid her. To make his war respectable, Octavian had to persuade the world that a single queen, with no Roman legions of her own, was a threat worthy of the united strength of Italy. And the world, looking east at the fleets gathering in her pay, and the kings assembling at her table, found the idea entirely believable. Through that year, the 2 halves of the world gathered their strength. Antony and Cleopatra moved to Greece with an enormous force, perhaps 500 warships and 100,000 men, financed by Egypt's treasury, and the queen came with the fleet in person against the advice of Antony's Roman officers, who choked on taking orders in a war fought under a foreign monarch's paymastership. Some of them began, quietly, to slip away to Octavian, carrying the Allies' battle plans with them, and each empty tent at morning muster was worth a squadron to the enemy. For what use is a plan that the other side has already read? Octavian crossed the Adriatic with a leaner force, and, guided by his brilliant seasick-prone admiral, Agrippa, began strangling Antony's supply lines one harbour at a time. Through the summer of 31 BC, the great Allied fleet lay increasingly bottled up in the Ambracian Gulf, on the western coast of Greece, behind a narrow strait guarded by headlands, while hunger and malaria hollowed out its crews and desertion, hollowed out its command tents. The rowing benches emptied faster than they could be filled, and Antony's press gangs swept the countryside of Greece for replacements, seizing farmers, mule drivers, harvesters, anyone with arms, and travellers through that region told for years afterward how the war had reached down and taken the very men from the roads. Ships that could not be manned at all were burned at their moorings, so the enemy would never row them. Kings and senators stole away by night. Antony grew savage and suspicious. By September, the choice had narrowed to two, and the war council that faced it split down a line that had run through the whole campaign. Canidius, the loyal commander of the land army, urged Antony to burn the ships, fall back into Macedonia, and fight the kind of battle Antony had never lost, on ground, with legions, where Octavian, no soldier himself, would have to meet the best tactician, alive. It was sound advice, and it required abandoning the fleet, the treasury aboard it, and any secure line back to Egypt. Cleopatra argued the opposite, and her logic was equally iron. The fleet was Egypt's contribution, and Egypt's shield. The gold in her holds paid every soldier in the camp, and a land war in the Balkans could grind on for years, while Egypt lay open behind them, retreat by land or break out by sea. Cleopatra argued for the sea, for the fleet was Egypt's power, and the treasury of Egypt was loaded aboard her squadron. On the 2nd of September 31 BC, in the Channel, off a low promontory crowned with a temple of Apollo, the fleets came out and met. The promontory was called Actium. The Battle of Actium decided the ownership of the Roman world, and yet the men who fought it could hardly see it. And the historians who described it never quite agreed on what they had seen. Let it unfold slowly, the way it unfolded that day, in the bright wind of a September noon, as Antony walked the shore. In those last days, one of his veterans, a centurion whose body was seamed with the scars of 100 fights for him, is said to have caught his eye, and called out through tears, "Imperator, why do you distrust these wounds and this sword, and put your hope in miserable planks of wood? Let the Egyptians and Phoenicians do their fighting on the sea, but give us land, where we know how to stand, and either conquer or die." Antony made no answer, Plutarch says. He only looked at the man, gestured with his hand and his face, as if to bid him take heart, and walked on. And there was no great hope in the gesture. The decision was made. Antony's fleet came out of the Gulf. In the morning, great ships of war, many of them enormous, with towers on their decks and bronze-plated bows, but undermanned, their rowing benches thinned by months of fever and hunger. He formed them in a line across the mouth of the strait, and waited, hoping Octavian's fleet would charge into the narrow water, where his heavy ships would have the advantage. Behind the battle line, in reserve, lay Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, and aboard them, in a detail that his Roman officers had noted with disbelief, the fleet carried its masts and sails, which warships always left ashore before a battle, and the war chest of the whole campaign, the gold of Egypt in the holds. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa refused the trap. His lighter, fresher ships stood off in open water and waited. And for hours, the two greatest fleets on Earth simply looked at each other across a mile of shining sea, while gulls turned and cried overhead. And on the hills around the Gulf, on both shores, the land armies stood in their tens of thousands and watched, spectators at the deciding of their own fates, close enough to see the flash of oars and too far to do anything at all. The ships themselves deserve a moment, because nothing like those fleets would ever gather again. Antony's line included the great beasts of Hellenistic naval architecture, ships rated at 8 and 9 and 10 banks of oars, floating fortresses with bows sheathed in bronze, their decks carrying towers from which artillery could hurl stones and bolts down onto an enemy. A single one of them might carry hundreds of rowers and hundreds of marines. Against them, Agrippa relied on speed and seamanship. Lighter galleys that could dart in, sheer off a bank of oars, and dance away before the monster could turn. The morning had been spent in silence and prayer, on both sides, the crews standing to their benches, the marines sweating under their armour in the ripening heat, close to 200,000 men, by some reckonings, waiting on a stretch of water a few miles wide. Past midday, the daily wind off the sea began to rise, and the lines at last ground together. It was not a battle of sweeping manoeuvres, but a vast, grinding, smoking brawl, small ships swarming big ones like wolves around oxen, grappling hooks and boarding bridges, javelins and fire pots, arcing between decks, marines fighting hand to hand on burning ships. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, with everything still undecided, it happened. A gap opened in the centre of the melee, and through it, with the freshening wind behind them, came Cleopatra's 60 ships under full purple sail, not joining the fight, but running before the wind, south, away, toward the open sea and Egypt. And Antony, watching from his flagship, did the thing that no Roman ever forgave. He left the battle. He transferred to a swift 5-banked galley and sailed after her, abandoning his fleet while it was still fighting, abandoning his army of tens of thousands encamped on the shore, chasing a purple sail over the horizon. His ships fought on for hours without him, not knowing he was gone, and burned and surrendered into the evening. His flagship could not follow him. Its commander fought on and went down fighting. As the afternoon burned away, Agrippa's crews worked the great ships over one by one, hurling fire, and by evening the water of the strait was lit by burning hulls, and the sea, an ancient historian wrote, was stained for a great distance. Thousands of men died in the water and the flames, and the rest surrendered as darkness fell, and a rainstorm swept the wreckage. His land army, leaderless and disbelieving, held together for a week, refusing at first to accept that Antony had truly gone, and then went over to Octavian in Tyre, 19 legions and 12,000 horse, the last great army of the Roman East, changing masters without a blow. Octavian's poets would sing of it forever after, as the cowardly flight of a queen and her enslaved lover. Modern historians read it differently, as a planned breakout, agreed in council beforehand. The only move left to a blockaded fleet: save the treasury, save the queen, escape to Egypt, and fight again. And the sails and the gold aboard her ships say the plan was real. But no plan required what Antony did next. Overtaking Cleopatra's flagship, he was taken aboard, and then he went to the bow and sat down alone, his head in his hands, and did not speak to her, the sources say, for 3 days. He was a Roman commander who had run from a battle. Something in him never stood up again. There was one strange coda to the flight, and Plutarch tells it. As the escaping squadron ran south, Light ships from the victorious fleet gave chase, and one drove ahead of the rest, its commander standing on the deck, shaking a spear. Antony, rousing himself, stood up at the stern and called across the water, "Who is this who pursues Antony?" And the answer came back over the waves. "I am Eurycles, the son of Lachares, and the fortune of Caesar gives me the chance to avenge my father." A man Antony had once executed, the Spartan did not reach Antony's ship. He rammed and captured the second flagship instead, and another vessel loaded with plate and furnishings, and fell away astern with his prizes, leaving Antony to sink back into his silence at the bow. Even his vengeances that day brushed past him and took something else. The ships ran south before the wind, and behind them, in the smoke over the Ambracian Gulf, the future of the world settled quietly onto Octavian's shoulders. The news went out from that gulf in widening rings, by dispatch boat and signal fire and rumour, to Athens and Ephesus and Antioch, to the client kings who began composing letters of congratulation to a man they had toasted against a month before, and at last across the water to Alexandria, where a queen who had staked 20 years of statecraft on a single afternoon began calculating, before the ashes of her fleet had cooled, what could still be saved, and finding, when the counting was done, that the answer was Egypt itself, the treasury, her children, and time, perhaps, a year of it, which, in her hands, had always been enough before. They came home to Alexandria in the sharp light of autumn, and Cleopatra came home first, with her ships dressed as if for victory, garlands on the prows and music playing, because she knew her city, and she knew that if Alexandria learned the truth before her grip was sure, the mob might finish what Actium had begun. Then she went to work with the cold clarity that had carried her through every disaster since she was 18. Suspected traitors were purged, money was raised from temples and tombs, and she reached for schemes that still astonish. Plans were begun to drag ships across the desert from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, beyond Octavian's reach, so that she and her treasure and her son might escape entirely to Arabia or even India, and begin again on another ocean. The first squadron was actually hauled across and burned on the far shore by an Arab king with old grudges, and the Great Escape quietly died on that far shore, in smoke, before it had properly begun. Antony, meanwhile, was dying in a different way. He built himself a hermit's lodge on a breakwater in the harbour, and sulked in it, calling himself Timon after the famous hater of mankind, until the queen coaxed him back to the palace. The old society of the inimitable livers was dissolved, and the circle founded a new one in its place, with a name that shivers even at this distance. They called it the Companions in Death, and its members feasted together as splendidly as ever, taking turns at banquets, while everyone at the table understood exactly what the club's name meant. The Queen, in these months, pursued a darker study as well, and the ancient writers report it without blinking. She began to research painless death, comparing venoms and poisons, asking which brought agony and which brought only sleep, and she is said to have concluded that among all of them, the bite of the asp alone drew a person down gently, into a heaviness like falling asleep, with no convulsion and no cry, the face keeping its calm to the end. She was not a woman who left her last option unexamined, and the city itself seemed to feel the ending coming. On one of the final nights before the fall, a story spread through Alexandria that would be retold for 2,000 years. In the middle of the night, when the streets were silent and every ear was straining toward the enemy camp, people said they heard music, the sound of many instruments and voices, a great invisible procession with cries and dances, moving through the centre of the city toward the eastern gate, the gate facing Octavian, and out through it and away until the sound faded into the dark. And those who pondered its meaning said that the god Dionysus, the god whom Antony had claimed all his life, whose festivals he had led and whose name he had worn, was leaving him. And in the midst of it all, the queen staged one more festival, because festivals were a language she had spoken all her life. With the enemy gathering and the treasury moving into the mausoleum, Alexandria was given days of celebration for a double coming of age. Antyllus, Antony's eldest son by Fulvia, formally put on the plain toga of a Roman man, and Caesarion, 16 years old, was enrolled among the ephebes, the young men of the Greek city, each ceremony declaring to the world that the next generation stood ready. The city, understanding perfectly, and perhaps loving them for the defiance of it, feasted anyway. It was courage wearing the costume of confidence, and it fooled no one and heartened everyone. That winter, embassies crossed the sea. Cleopatra offered Octavian her abdication if Egypt could pass to her children. Antony offered to live as a private citizen. Octavian answered the queen, unofficially, softly, with hints that she might expect anything if she would only kill Antony, and did not answer Antony at all. One of those envoys left a mark on the record. Octavian sent a smooth freedman named Thyrsus to deal with the queen, and the man held such long and private audiences with her that Antony, watching his world shrink to the size of a palace, boiled over with jealousy, had the envoy seized and whipped and sent him back to Octavian with a message that survives in all its ragged pride. "If you find this an outrage," Antony wrote, "you have my freedman Hipparchus, who deserted me. Hang him up and whip him, and we shall be even." Octavian, who never let anger interfere with arithmetic, filed the insult away with the others. Behind the courtesies, he wanted one thing: the treasure of the Ptolemies intact, for his own unpaid legions were close to mutiny, and he feared above everything that the queen would burn her gold. She had, in fact, piled it, along with pearls and ivory and cinnamon, in her new mausoleum by the temple of Isis, with firewood stacked beneath, and let him know it. Through the spring of 30 BC, the ring closed. Octavian's armies came at Egypt from east and west at once. Pelusium, the eastern gate, fell almost without a fight, and at the end of July, Octavian himself stood in the suburbs of Alexandria. On the last day, the 1st of August, Antony rose as a soldier one final time. At dawn, his cavalry actually drove back Octavian's horsemen. One last flare of the old fire, and he came back glowing to kiss the queen. Then he watched from high ground as his fleet rode out toward the enemy, raised its oars in salute, and changed sides in a body, and his cavalry followed it, and it was over. Antony, crying betrayal, returned to a palace dissolving in panic, and there received word, false word, sent perhaps in fear, or perhaps in a desperate misjudgment, that Cleopatra was dead. He did not question the news. He went to his chamber, unbuckled his armour, and asked his servant Eros to keep an old promise and kill him. Eros drew the sword, turned, and killed himself instead. Antony ran himself through the belly and fell on the couch. But the wound would not finish its work, and as he lay begging bystanders to end it, new word came, true word this time. The queen lived. She was barricaded in her mausoleum with 2 waiting women. He asked to be taken to her. And so the dying Antony was carried through the streets to the tomb, and since the great door was sealed and could not be opened without letting in the enemy, ropes were lowered from the upper window. And Cleopatra and her 2 women, straining with everything they had, hauled the bleeding man up the outside wall, while a crowd below watched in horror, the queen's arms shaking. Antony reaching up to her. Those who saw it said they never saw anything more pitiable. She got him inside, laid him on a bed, tore her dress over him, and beat her breast, calling him her lord and husband and emperor. He asked for wine, drank it, told her to save herself if she could do it without dishonour, and to trust of Octavian's men, only one. And then, saying that he was a Roman ended by a Roman, which was the last comfort left to him, he died in her arms. He was 53. She was 39, and the world she had spent her whole life building had just bled out onto her lap. Below the tower, the noise of the falling city rose and faded through the afternoon, and Octavian's soldiers moved through streets that offered no resistance, and by evening Alexandria, which had rioted against kings for 3 centuries, lay perfectly still. She lasted 9 days more, and she spent them fighting, because she did not know how to spend a day otherwise. The taking of the queen was accomplished by exactly the man Antony, with his dying breath, had told her to trust. Gaius Proculius came to the mausoleum, and Cleopatra, keeping the great door sealed, negotiated with him through the barred grille, asking the kingdom for her children, and he answered soothingly and studied the building. He came back with another officer, Cornelius Gallus, and while Gallus stood at the door and kept her in long conversation, Proculius set a ladder against the wall, entered through the very window, by which the dying Antony had been hauled up, and came down the stairs behind her with 2 men. One of her women cried out, "Unhappy Cleopatra, you are taken alive," and the queen spun, drew a dagger from her belt, and raised it against herself. And Proculius closed the distance and caught her arm, and pinned her hands, and shook the blade away, and then, the sources add, searched her clothing for poison. So Antony's last piece of advice completed its work. She was seized in her own tomb, alive, by the one Roman he had vouched for. After that she was guarded night and day, above all against her own hands, for she was the last obstacle between Octavian and the treasure, and he needed her alive, at least for now, and docile, at least in public. He allowed her to bury Antony with royal honours, and she did, and something in her seems to have finished with that burial. She fell ill, refused food, and was bullied back to eating by threats against her children. Then came the single meeting between the last pharaoh and the future emperor. Octavian called on her in her chamber, and the accounts of it differ like witnesses at a trial. In one she lay wrecked by grief on a pallet, her hair torn, her voice trembling, pleading her old friendship with his adoptive father Caesar. In another she was composed and precise, handing over inventories of her treasure, and when a steward stepped forward to accuse her of hiding some jewels, she flew at him and struck him, then remarked that she had kept back only a few trinkets as gifts for Octavian's wife and sister, so that they might speak kindly for her. Octavian, pleased, assured her of generous treatment, and left believing she wished to live. She had taken his measure in one interview, as she had taken other men's measures all her life. And what she found in this one was something she had never met in Caesar or Antony, a man on whom none of her instruments would work. Not wit, not charm, not grandeur, not even honesty, because he wanted nothing from her except her presence in a parade. He needed her, walking behind his chariot, far more than he needed her forgiven. He would parade her in chains through Rome, as her sister Arsinoe had been paraded, the last queen of Egypt displayed to the roaring crowds as the trophy of the age, and after the parade, her life or death would be a matter of administrative convenience. She had spent 22 years reading the intentions of Roman men, and she read this one to the bottom. A friend in his camp confirmed the plan and the date. And so, on a warm day in late August of 30 BC, The 10th day after Antony's death, Cleopatra asked and was granted leave to visit his tomb. She poured wine on the stone and laid flowers on it, and the words the histories give her, "At that tomb are gentle and terrible at once. Nothing parted us while we lived," she is made to say, "but in death we are likely to change places. You, the Roman, lying in Egyptian ground, and I, unhappy woman, to be led through Italy. If there is any strength in the gods of that country," she asked, "do not abandon your wife alive. Do not let me be led in triumph over you, but hide me here and bury me beside you. For of all my countless sorrows, none has been so great as this brief time I have lived apart from you." Then she kissed the stone. Then she returned, bathed and dined magnificently. A countryman arrived at the guarded door carrying a basket, and the soldiers, as soldiers will, stopped him and asked what was in it. He lifted the leaves and showed them figs, so plump and fine that they exclaimed at the beauty of them, and the man smiled and told them to take some for themselves, and they did, and waved him through, and the basket, with its figs and its leaves and whatever slept beneath the leaves, passed into the queen's chamber. The 2 women who stayed with her deserve their names spoken slowly, because they had earned them. Iras, who dressed the queen's hair, and Charmian, her closest attendant, had been beside her through the flight from Actium, the siege, the captivity, every narrowing month. And when the choice came to leave or stay, they stayed, knowing precisely what staying meant. After the meal, she sent Octavian a sealed letter and dismissed everyone but her 2 women, Iris and Charmian. When Octavian opened the letter, it asked only one thing, that she be buried beside Antony, and he understood instantly and sent men running. They found the doors closed. When they broke through, Cleopatra lay dead on a golden couch, dressed in her full royal robes, the diadem on her brow. Iris lay dying at her feet. Charmian, herself swaying, was straightening the crown on her mistress's head. And when one of the soldiers burst out, "A fine deed, this, Charmian," she answered with her last breath. "It is very fine indeed, and fitting for the descendant of so many kings, and fell." There was meaning folded into every detail of that final scene for those with eyes to read it. The robes were the robes of Isis, in which she had presided over the donations at the height of her power. The diadem was the band of Hellenistic kingship her ancestors had worn since Ptolemy I, and if the famous serpent was real, it was no ordinary instrument. For the rearing cobra was the uraeus, the emblem that had risen from the brow of every pharaoh for 3,000 years, the divine protector of Egyptian kings, whose strike was said to grant immortality. She would not be poisoned like a victim. She would be crowned one last time by Egypt itself. How the thing was done, no one ever established. The famous story tells of an asp, an Egyptian cobra, smuggled in beneath the figs, the serpent of royal Egypt, whose bite, men believed, conferred divinity. And searchers claimed to find 2 faint marks on her arm, though no snake was ever found in the chamber, only, some said, a faint track in the sand along the wall toward the sea, which is exactly the detail a good story would grow, and by then the story had already escaped anyone's power to correct it. Others spoke of poison hidden in a hollow hairpin. Octavian, cheated and privately furious, publicly admired her courage, and in his triumph at Rome, he could only carry her image, a painted effigy with a serpent at its arm. Past crowds who, remembering another paraded princess, felt more awe than hatred. He granted her request. She was buried beside Antony in the tomb by the sea. She was 39 years old, and she had reigned for 22 years, and with her the line of the pharaohs, after 3,000 years, came to its end. There remained the children, and the accounting was swift and cold. Caesarion, 17 years old, King of Kings, son of the deified Julius, had been sent south for safety in the last days, up the Nile with part of the treasure, and a small trusted escort, making for the Red Sea ports, and, beyond them, India, the same eastern horizon his mother had once looked toward. He might have vanished into Asia and lived out his days as a wealthy stranger. But on the road, his tutor Rhodon persuaded him to turn back, arguing that Octavian meant to give him Egypt, and whether the man was a fool or a bought traitor, the histories never settled. Octavian meant nothing of the kind. One of the emperor's philosophers is said to have observed, adapting a line of Homer, that it is not good to have too many Caesars, and the boy, who was the last living son of Julius Caesar, was quietly killed. Antony's eldest son by Fulvia was dragged from sanctuary and executed as well, but the 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra, the sun, the moon, and little Philadelphus, were spared, carried to Rome, made to walk in the triumph beside the effigy of their mother, and then, in one of history's stranger mercies, handed to Octavia, Antony's abandoned Roman wife, who raised her husband's children by her rival with the same steadiness she had shown all her life. The 2 boys fade from the record and were probably dead within a few years. But Cleopatra, Selene, the daughter, lived, and her story is a quiet moonlit epilogue to her mother's blazing one. She was married to a scholarly African prince named Juba, and the 2 were set on the throne of Mauretania, far to the west. There, on the Atlantic coast, Selene built a capital with palaces and a library and Greek art, named it Caesarea, and minted coins bearing her name in Greek, Queen Cleopatra, with the crescent moon, and, on some, the crocodile of Egypt. A daughter of the last Pharaoh, ruling in her mother's style at the far end of the world. Her husband Juba was a story in himself, a Numidian prince, who had walked as a small child in one of Caesar's triumphs, just as Selene had walked in Octavian's, and who had grown up in Rome to become one of the most learned men of the age, author of works on history, geography, painting, and the theatre. The 2 of them made their little Mauritanian court a distant echo of Alexandria, and Juba's books on Africa and on the routes to the east were still being quoted by Roman scholars. Generations later, Selene struck coins throughout her reign, and modern collectors still turn them over under lamplight, small discs of silver, with her mother's proud profile living on in her own. When she died, a court poet wrote that the moon herself had darkened in mourning for her namesake. Her son, named Ptolemy, the very last of the dynasty to rule anywhere, governed Mauretania into the reign of the emperor Caligula, who invited his wealthy cousin to Rome, and then, envious, so the sources say, of the splendour of the young king's purple cloak at the games, had him killed. So the line of Ptolemy ended, as it had so often lived, at a Roman's convenience, and yet even that was not quite the end. For through Selene's granddaughters, the blood ran quietly onward into the royal houses of the East, into queens of Syria and beyond, thinning and dispersing down the centuries, like a river reaching its delta, until it vanished, not into death, but simply into the general sea of humankind. Which means, if you follow the arithmetic of ancestry across 2,000 years, that her line has not ended at all, only widened beyond all tracing, and somewhere in the world tonight, unknowing, her descendants are falling asleep. Her descendants married into royal lines across the East, and the blood of the Ptolemies flowed on quietly for generations after Rome believed the story closed. Octavian entered Alexandria with careful theatre of his own. He announced to the frightened citizens that he spared their city, first for the sake of its founder Alexander, second for its beauty, and third as a favour to his old tutor Arius, an Alexandrian philosopher walking at his side, and the city, which had expected a sack, breathed again. He asked to see one thing. The tomb of Alexander was opened for him, and the conqueror of the world looked down at the conqueror of the world, 3 centuries dead, in his crystal coffin, and laid a golden crown on him and scattered flowers, and one story insists, touched the face, and a piece of the nose broke away under his fingers. When his hosts then offered to show him the tombs of the Ptolemies as well, he declined with a sentence that buried the dynasty more finely than any spade. "I came to see a king," he said, "not corpses." Egypt itself became something unique, not an ordinary province, but the personal estate of the emperor, its grain the anchor of Rome's food supply, so precious that Roman senators were forbidden even to visit without permission. A prefect of the emperor's own choosing, governed from Alexandria, the Nile floods were measured and taxed, as they had been under the pharaohs and the Ptolemies alike, and the enormous machine of the river valley simply changed its master and kept turning as it had changed masters before. Egypt became, too, the ancient world's great destination, and Romans went there as tourists, sailing up the river as Caesar and Cleopatra once had, hiring guides, marvelling at the pyramids and scratching their names on the old stones where some of that graffiti can still be read, small voices from 2,000 years ago saying only, "I was here and I wondered," and the strangest continuity of all was carved in stone. The temples of Egypt did not close when the last pharaoh died. The priesthoods carried on, and since the rites required a pharaoh, they simply carved the new masters into the role. And so, on temple walls, up and down the Nile you can find Augustus himself, and Tiberius, and a dozen emperors after them, portrayed in the full ancient costume, the kilt and the double crown, making offerings to Horus and Hathor, Romans who never set foot in Egypt transformed by the chisel into sons of Ra, because the river's religion was older than any conqueror, and simply absorbed them all. The old faith burned down slowly, over centuries, like a very long candle. The last known hieroglyphic inscription ever carved was cut at the island temple of Philae, far to the south, in the year 394 of our era, more than 400 years after Cleopatra's death, and after it the oldest writing on earth fell silent, holding its secrets until a stone found at Rosetta, in her own delta, taught the world to read it again. Alexandria remained one of the great cities of the world for centuries more, its lighthouse burning, its scholars arguing, until earthquakes took the tower stone by stone into the harbour, where French archaeologists, diving in the 1990s, found its colossal blocks and broken statues of Ptolemies sleeping on the seabed. Cleopatra's own tomb has never been found. It lies, most likely, beneath the modern city, or beneath the sea that swallowed the palace quarter long ago. And somewhere in that drowned ground, perhaps, the last queen of Egypt still rests beside her Roman, exactly as she asked. And so we are left with the memory, which is a story of its own, and a strangely restful one to end on. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor, and his version of the queen, the drinking, scheming temptress of the East, was carved into Roman literature by the finest poets who ever wrote for a government. Yet even they could not hold the line. Horace, in the very poem celebrating her defeat, stops mocking her halfway through and ends in open admiration. No humble woman, he calls her, unbroken, gazing on her ruined palace, with a face serene, brave enough to handle the serpents calmly, fiercer in her chosen death, denying the cruel warships, cheating the triumph. No humble woman she. The propagandist's poem ends as a funeral hymn for the enemy, and no one seems to have minded, because everyone, on some level, agreed. Of the woman herself, almost nothing physical survives. No verified statue face, no tomb, and not one certain line in her own hand, with one possible, wonderful exception. In a scrap of papyrus recovered from mummy wrappings, a royal ordinance of the year 33 BC grants sweeping tax exemptions to a great Roman, very likely that same Canidius who commanded Antony's army, and at the bottom, beneath the clerk's neat script, a different pen has added a single Greek word of authorization, ginestho, make it happen. Some scholars believe that word was written by the queen herself, and if they are right, it is her entire surviving literary output, and it could not be more perfect if she had chosen it. 2 syllables of pure command, make it happen, which was, after all, the business of her whole life. Her real inheritance scattered outward in quieter ways. The calendar Caesar built with Alexandrian astronomy, and that her city's science made possible, is, with one small adjustment, the calendar by which you are falling asleep tonight. Egyptian priests kept her cult alive for centuries, and statues of Isis with Cleopatra's face travelled the trade roads of the empire. Egypt kept its own memorial, and it still stands, on the rear wall of the great temple of Hathor. At Dendera, far up the Nile, an enormous relief carved in her lifetime shows Cleopatra as Pharaoh in the full ancient manner, crowned with the sun disk and horns of the goddess, making offerings to the gods of Egypt, and beside her, shown as a grown king, stands the child Caesarion. Travellers can walk up to that wall today, and stand where her sculptors stood, and the Queen of the Nile looks over their heads, exactly as she chose to be seen by her own people, not a seductress of Romans, but a daughter of Ra, the latest in an unbroken line reaching back past memory. It is the largest portrait of her in existence, and it is the one she approved. Medieval Arab scholars in Egypt remembered her not as a seductress at all, but as a sage, the virtuous scholar queen, author of works on medicine and measures. Chaucer, writing in medieval England, put her first among his legends. Of good women, a martyr of faithful love, which would have surprised the Romans very much. Renaissance princes hung her death scene in their galleries. Shakespeare, borrowing from Plutarch scene by scene, and sometimes line by line, gave her the greatest ending in English drama, a queen who calls for her robe and her crown, and declares she has immortal longings in her, and made the phrase infinite variety hers forever. Age cannot wither her, the play says, nor custom stale her infinite variety. He wrote it around 1606, 16 centuries after her death, and he understood her, perhaps, better than her contemporaries did, because he was also a professional of theatre, and he recognised a fellow master when he met one in the pages of Plutarch. Painters gave her pearls and serpents and dyings, swoons by candlelight. Hollywood gave her Theda Bara in 1917, in a film now lost, but for a few seconds of flickering frames, and then Elizabeth Taylor in 1963, in a production so vast that it nearly sank one of the great studios, the most expensive film ever made to that day. Its sets of Alexandria rising beside Rome, like a memory arguing with itself. Astronomers, not to be outdone, fixed her in the sky. A crater on Venus bears her name, and out in the asteroid belt tumbles a strange bone-shaped rock called Cleopatra, attended by 2 small moons, which its discoverers named Alex Helios and Cleoselene, after her twins, the sun and the moon, still circling their mother after 2,000 years. Every generation, without exception, has redrawn her face to suit its own dreams and fears, which is perhaps the surest proof of power there is. The searchers, meanwhile, have never given up. Beneath the modern city of Alexandria, archaeologists have mapped the drowned royal quarter, and divers glide today over toppled columns and sphinxes where the palace gardens stood. photographing red granite in the green underwater light. West of the city, at a ruined temple called Taposiris Magna, excavators have spent years pursuing a theory that the Queen and Antony were carried out of the capital and buried in the sanctuary of Osiris there, and they have brought up coins bearing her face and the bones of nobles, though not, so far, the tomb itself. Perhaps they will find it in your lifetime, a sealed chamber and 2 coffins side by side. Perhaps the sea keeps it, and always will. There is a kind of rightness either way, for a woman who controlled her own image so completely in life, to keep control of her resting place forever after. Because here is the quiet truth beneath all the paint. She was a working monarch of ferocious ability, who kept an ancient, indebted, coveted kingdom independent for 22 years in the shadow of the greatest military power on earth, using every instrument she possessed: languages, fleets, grain, theatre, courage, and yes, charm, which in her hands was simply diplomacy conducted at close range. She lost in the end because Egypt's independence was always going to end, and she nearly, so very nearly, did not lose. The men who beat her had to build their empire's founding legend, partly out of the size of her threat. There were 6 queens named Cleopatra in her family before her, and the name itself, in Greek, means glory of her father. Yet when the world says Cleopatra, it has only ever meant one woman, the 7th, the last, as if all the others merely kept the name safe until she arrived to fill it. That is what final victory over Octavian looks like. At the distance of 2,000 years, his propaganda survives, but so does she. Larger than the propaganda, larger than the facts, one of the very few human beings from the whole ancient world whose name needs no explanation anywhere on earth. Every empire has a story it tells in the dark, and Rome's began with a woman on a golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, who refused to walk in anyone's parade. And here our story settles into stillness. The great harbour is quiet now. The lighthouse fire has burned down to an ember, and the ember to a memory, and the memory to the soft sound of water against stone. The palaces sleep beneath the sea. The scrolls have drifted into dust, and the queen rests where she asked to rest, beside her Roman, somewhere under the warm dark. The names grow quiet, the years let go of one another, and drift apart like boats at evening. Let them drift. Let Alexandria fade behind you, its lamps going out one by one along the shore, and let your breathing slow to the rhythm of that ancient, patient sea. The story is told, and it will keep until morning. Rest now, let it all go. Sleep well and good night.